The autumn wind rattled the old windows of 1247 Elm Street as Jessica Martinez carefully placed the Ouija board on the scratched wooden coffee table. The Halloween party had been winding down for the past hour, with most of their college friends already heading back to their dorms, leaving behind empty beer bottles and the lingering smell of cheap pizza. Only her two closest friends remained, Mike Chen, who was sprawled across the worn couch still wearing his vampire costume, and David Thompson, who sat cross-legged on the floor, his zombie makeup smeared from laughing too hard at horror movies they'd been watching all evening. "Come on, guys, one more game before we call it a night," Jessica said, her voice carrying that particular mix of excitement and nervous energy that comes with being 20 years old and feeling invincible. She had found the board earlier that week at a thrift store downtown, tucked between a collection of dusty romance novels and a broken lamp. The elderly woman behind the counter had given her an odd look when she'd placed it on the counter, her weathered fingers tracing the edges of the box before muttering something about some things being better left alone. But Jessica had brushed off the warning with the confidence of youth, thinking it would be perfect for their Halloween party. The house they were renting was typical of the older homes near campus, a two-story Victorian that had seen better days, with creaking floorboards, drafty windows, and a basement that always felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. They had moved in just 2 months earlier, drawn by the cheap rent and the fact that it was within walking distance of their classes. The landlord, a nervous man in his 50s named Mr. Patterson, had been almost too eager to rent it to them, barely asking for references and accepting their deposit with hands that trembled slightly as he counted the bills. Mike stretched and yawned, his plastic fangs catching the dim light from the table lamp. "Jess, you know those things don't actually work, right? It's just people moving the piece around without realizing it." He had always been the skeptical one of their group, the psychology major who had an explanation for everything supernatural. His parents had raised him to believe in science and logic, and he approached the world with the methodical mind of someone destined for graduate school. David, however, was already moving closer to the table, his dark eyes reflecting a curiosity that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count. Growing up in a small town in Louisiana, he had been raised on stories of ghosts and spirits, of things that went bump in the night and shadows that moved on their own. His grandmother had always warned him about messing with forces beyond human understanding, but tonight, surrounded by friends and emboldened by beer, those warnings felt like distant echoes. "What's the worst that could happen?" David said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Besides, it's Halloween. If we're going to try to talk to ghosts, tonight's the night to do it." Jessica arranged 3 candles around the board, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The old house seemed to settle around them with a series of soft groans and whispers, the kind of sounds that old buildings make as they cool down for the night. She had grown used to these noises over the past 2 months, but tonight they seemed somehow more pronounced, as if the house itself was paying attention to what they were about to do. "Okay, so how does this work?" Jessica asked, pulling her long dark hair back into a ponytail. She had always been the organizer of their group, the one who planned their study sessions and weekend adventures. Coming from a large, close-knit Mexican-American family, she was used to taking care of others, but she also had a streak of curiosity that sometimes led her into situations her more cautious relatives would have avoided. Mike rolled his eyes but joined them at the table, his scientific skepticism warring with his loyalty to his friends. "You put your fingers on the planchette, that's the little pointer thing, and ask questions. Then you wait for it to move to letters and spell out answers. But it's just your subconscious mind making tiny movements. There's nothing supernatural about it." The 3 friends positioned themselves around the board, their fingers barely touching the smooth wooden planchette. The room fell quiet except for the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Jessica felt a strange chill run down her spine, though she attributed it to the drafty old house in the late hour. "Is anyone there?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt slightly foolish, but there was something about the atmosphere, the flickering candles, the old house settling around them, the weight of the night, that made her speak more softly than usual. For a long moment, nothing happened. Mike was about to make another sarcastic comment when the planchette suddenly jerked to life, sliding smoothly across the board to the word yes. All three friends looked at each other with wide eyes. "Did you move it?" Jessica whispered to David, who shook his head vigorously. "I thought you did," David replied, his voice tight with sudden nervousness. Mike frowned, his analytical mind trying to process what had just happened. "One of us must have moved it without realizing. It's a well-documented psychological phenomenon." But even as he spoke, the planchette began to move again, this time sliding from letter to letter with purpose and precision. WELCOMEHOME. "Welcome home?" Jessica read aloud, her voice cracking slightly. "That's weird." David swallowed hard, remembering his grandmother's stories about spirits that knew things they shouldn't know. "Maybe we should ask who it is." "Who are you?" Jessica asked, her hands trembling slightly on the planchette. The response came quickly, too quickly for any of them to be consciously guiding it. "HAROLD. Harold," Mike said, though his skeptical tone was beginning to waver. "Okay, Harold, if you're really here, tell us something we don't know." What happened next would haunt all three of them for the rest of their lives. The planchette began to move with increasing speed and confidence, spelling out their exact address, 1-2-4-7 ELNSTREET. The room seemed to grow colder, and Jessica felt the hair on her arms stand up. None of them had mentioned their address aloud, and the idea that they were somehow subconsciously spelling it out seemed ridiculous. "That's just coincidence," Mike said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "We all know our own address." But the board wasn't finished. It continued spelling, BUILT 1893 BYJOSEPHWILSON. David grabbed his phone and quickly searched for information about their house. After a few minutes of scrolling through local historical records, his face went pale. "Guys," he said, his voice barely audible, "it's right. The house was built in 1893 by someone named Joseph Wilson. I found it in the county records." Jessica felt her mouth go dry. "But how could we know that? We never looked up the history of the house." The planchette was moving again, FIRSTDEATH 1908 MARYWILSONFEVER. Mike's hands were shaking now as he helped guide the planchette. His scientific worldview was crumbling with each impossible revelation. "This can't be happening," he muttered. David was frantically searching on his phone again. "Mary Wilson died in 1908, he confirmed, his voice hollow. "It says here she died of typhoid fever in the front bedroom." The front bedroom, the room where Jessica slept every night. The board continued its relentless revelation, SECONDDEATH 1942ROBERTWILSONWAR. "Robert Wilson, died 1942, David read from his phone, his voice getting weaker with each confirmation. "Killed in action in World War II. His body was never returned home." But it was the next message that made Jessica's blood turn to ice. THIRDDEATH 1978 HAROLDBLACKWOODBASEMENT. "Harold Blackwood," Jessica whispered. That's who's talking to us." The planchette moved to spell, YES. Mike pulled his hands away from the board as if it had burned him. "This is impossible. This is absolutely impossible." But the board wasn't done revealing its secrets. Even without Mike's touch, the planchette continued to move under Jessica and David's trembling fingers. IDIEDTRYINGTOFINDMYWIFE. David's research confirmed what they were all beginning to dread. Harold Blackwood had indeed died in the house in 1978, found in the basement by a neighbor who had come to check on him after not seeing him for several days. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but the circumstances were strange. He had been found surrounded by candles, occult books, and what appeared to be ritual materials. His wife died 2 years before him, David read from an old newspaper obituary he had found online. Eleanor Blackwood died 1976. It says here that Harold became obsessed with trying to contact her spirit after her death. The board spelled out SHNEVERCAME. Jessica felt tears welling up in her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. There was something heartbreaking about the simple admission, something that spoke to the desperate loneliness of a man who had loved his wife so much that he had literally died trying to reach her. "Harold," she said softly, "are you still trying to find her?" "YESBUTSHEISNOTHERE. Where is she?" David asked. "THELIGHTTOOKHERIAMLEFTBHIND. The room fell silent except for the sound of their rapid breathing. Jessica could feel Harold's loneliness as if it were a physical presence in the room, a grief so profound that it had anchored his spirit to the house for over 4 years. "Harold," Mike said, his skepticism finally crumbling completely, "can you prove you're really here? Can you show us something?" The response came immediately, "CHECKTHEBASEMENTBHINDTHEFURNACELOOSEBRICK." All three friends looked at each other with a mixture of terror and fascination. The basement had always felt wrong to them, colder than the rest of the house and filled with an oppressive atmosphere that made them avoid it whenever possible. They had never explored it thoroughly, using it only to access the washer and dryer that the landlord had installed near the stairs. "We have to go look," Jessica said, though every fiber of her being was screaming at her to run. Mike stood up on shaky legs. "This is insane. We're actually going to go into a creepy basement in the middle of the night because a Ouija board told us to." But curiosity had taken hold of all of them, that dangerous human need to know the truth even when the truth might destroy them. They gathered flashlights and made their way down the narrow wooden steps to the basement, each creak of the old board seeming unnaturally loud in the silence. The basement was exactly as unwelcoming as they remembered: low ceiling, damp concrete walls, and the constant smell of mildew and something else they couldn't identify. The furnace squatted in the far corner like a sleeping monster, its pilot light casting eerie blue shadows on the surrounding walls. Behind the furnace, just as Harold had indicated, they found a section of the wall where one brick sat slightly loose from the others. David worked it free with trembling hands, and Jessica shone her flashlight into the revealed cavity. What they found inside changed everything. The space behind the brick contained a small wooden box, its surface carved with symbols none of them recognized. Inside the box were several items that made Jessica's breath catch in her throat. A faded photograph of a man and woman standing in front of their house, the woman's face bearing a striking resemblance to Jessica herself, a pair of wedding rings wrapped in yellowed cloth, and a leather journal bound with string. Mike opened the journal with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The pages were filled with Harold's handwriting, documenting his increasingly desperate attempts to contact his deceased wife. The entries began normally enough, with Harold describing his grief and his decision to try communicating with Eleanor through seances and spirit boards. But as the months passed, the entries became more frantic, describing voices in the walls, objects moving on their own, and the growing certainty that something else was answering his calls instead of his beloved wife. The final entry, dated just days before Harold's death, was barely legible, written in a hand that shook with either fear or illness. "She won't come to me, but something else will. It's been waiting in this house, waiting for someone foolish enough to open the door. I can feel it getting stronger every time I try to reach her. God forgive me, I think I've let something terrible into this world. The shadows move when they shouldn't. The walls whisper names of the dead. Eleanor, my darling, I'm coming to find you, but I fear I may have doomed whoever comes after me." As Jessica read these words aloud, the temperature in the basement dropped noticeably, and they could see their breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The pilot light on the furnace began to flicker, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flame. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, his voice tight with panic. "We need to get out of here right now." But as they turned toward the stairs, they heard something that froze their blood: footsteps on the floor above them, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the living room where they had left the Ouija board still set up on the coffee table. David grabbed Jessica's hand, and she could feel him trembling. "There's no one else in the house," he whispered. "We locked the doors. Everyone else left hours ago." The footsteps stopped directly above them, and in the silence that followed, They could hear something else, the sound of the planchette sliding across the Ouija board, spelling out messages to an empty room. They crept up the stairs as quietly as possible, their hearts pounding so hard they were sure whoever or whatever was in the living room would hear them coming. When they reached the top of the stairs, Jessica peered around the corner and had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming. The Ouija board was indeed moving on its own, the planchette sliding from letter to letter with purpose and speed. But more terrifying than that was the shadow standing beside the coffee table, a dark human-shaped silhouette that seemed to be watching the board's movements with intense interest. As they watched in horror, the shadow turned toward them, and though it had no features they could distinguish, they all felt the weight of its attention like a physical force. The candles they had left burning began to flicker wildly, and the temperature in the entire house seemed to drop. The planchette spelled out a final message, TOLATITSAWAKENOW. That night, the three friends grabbed their essential belongings and fled the house, spending the remainder of the night in Jessica's car in a 24-hour diner parking lot. When they returned the next morning with Mr. Patterson and 2 police officers, they found the house exactly as they had left it, except for one chilling detail: every mirror in the house had been shattered from the inside, and written in the dust on the living room floor were the words "Welcome Home" in handwriting that matched Harold Blackwood's journal. Further research revealed that the house had a history of paranormal activity stretching back decades. Previous tenants had reported voices in the walls, objects moving on their own, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Many had left after only a few months, and several had reported experiences with Ouija boards that had provided impossible information about the house's history. Most disturbing of all was the discovery they made in Harold's journal about the house's original owner, Joseph Wilson. According to Harold's research, Wilson had built the house on land that had been the site of a small cemetery in the 1800s. When the cemetery was relocated to make room for residential development, not all of the bodies had been moved. Some had been left behind, forgotten beneath the foundation of the house that would become a magnet for lost souls and desperate spirits. Harold Blackwood had not been the first person to die trying to contact the dead in that house, and the three friends realized with growing horror that they might not be the last. The presence they had awakened was not Harold's gentle, grieving spirit, but something far older and more malevolent that had been feeding on the grief and desperation of everyone who had tried to breach the barrier between life and death within those walls. Jessica, Mike, and David never returned to 1247 Elm Street. They broke their lease, forfeited their deposit, and found new living arrangements as far from the house as possible. But the experience had changed them in ways they were still discovering. Jessica found herself unable to sleep without checking every mirror in her apartment, terrified of what she might see reflected back at her. Mike, whose rational worldview had been shattered that night, dropped out of his psychology program and spent months in therapy trying to process what he had experienced. David started having dreams about Harold Blackwood, dreams in which the lonely old man begged him to return to the house and help him find his wife. Years later, they learned that the house had been demolished after a series of incidents that made it impossible to rent. The final straw came when a family of 4 moved in and, within a week, their 5-year-old daughter began speaking in the voice of an elderly man, claiming to be Harold and asking repeatedly for his wife Eleanor. The family fled, and the city condemned the property as a public safety hazard. But demolishing the house didn't end the story. The lot remained empty for years, with several attempts to build new structures ending in mysterious accidents and worker injuries. Local residents reported seeing lights in the basement area even after the house was gone, and more than one person claimed to have seen the shadowy figure of a man wandering the empty lot, calling out a woman's name. The 3 friends remained close, bound together by their shared experience and the knowledge that they had glimpsed something beyond the boundaries of the normal world. They never spoke about that night to anyone else, knowing that no one would believe them, but among themselves, they continued to process what they had experienced and what it meant. Jessica eventually became a teacher, drawn to work with children partly because their natural acceptance of the impossible reminded her that the world contained more mysteries than most adults were willing to acknowledge. Mike changed his career path entirely, becoming a carpenter who specialized in restoring old homes, though he always refused jobs that involved houses with histories of unexplained deaths or paranormal activity. David moved back to Louisiana, where his grandmother listened to his story with knowing nods and helped him understand that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed. The Ouija board that had started it all was burned in Jessica's parents' backyard 3 days after the incident, but even as the flames consumed it, all three friends swore they could hear a voice in the crackling wood, still calling out for Eleanor, still searching for a love that death had taken beyond his reach. They learned that grief, when it becomes obsession, can create its own kind of haunting, and that the desperate need to contact those we've lost can sometimes open pathways for things we never intended to invite in. Harold Blackwood's love for his wife had been beautiful and pure, but his inability to let her go had created a wound in the fabric of reality itself, a wound that had been festering in that house for decades before 3 college students stumbled upon it during what they thought would be a harmless Halloween game. The experience taught them that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened, and some questions better left unasked. But it also showed them that love, even when it becomes twisted by grief and desperation, remains one of the most powerful forces in both the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. To this day, none of them can explain exactly what happened that night, whether they had truly contacted Harold Blackwood's spirit or had somehow tapped into residual energy left behind by his tragic obsession. What they do know is that their casual experiment with the supernatural had consequences none of them could have anticipated, and that the house at 1247 Elm Street had been harboring secrets that were never meant to be discovered. The lot where the house once stood remains empty, though occasionally someone will place flowers there, yellow roses that were Eleanor Blackwood's favorite, left by unknown hands who perhaps understand that some love stories don't end with death, but continue in ways that can haunt the living for generations to come.